Thanks all. Well, thank you so much again for joining us here this evening. I'm Dave Javid with Plan to Place, part of the consultant team, and we're here tonight obviously to talk about the City of Los Altos housing element update process. This is our first workshop, so great to see you all. Before we get started, I'm going to hand it over to Laura Simpson to do a welcome.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming this evening to help us with our planning for the future of the City of Los Altos. I'm the Interim Planning Director, and I'm happy to have you here this evening, and I will introduce the whole team, which I think is on the next slide, but to talk about who's here this evening. So myself and Sonia Lee represent the city. Sonia is the Public Information Officer. And then we have our consultant team, Lisa Wise Consulting. Jennifer Murillo will do the general overview, the project presentation. And then we have David Bergman and Stefano Riccici from the consultant from Lisa Wise. And then Plan to Place, Dave Javid and Paul Kronzer will be here helping us to receive all your comments this evening. So we're very happy that you are able to make it and we can go ahead and get started. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laura. So real quick, I just wanted to note that we are going to have the meeting materials translated in 2 different languages, in Spanish and Mandarin. And these are for those native speakers that might have joined us here tonight to share that message with them as well, as we do want to make this accessible for all those that want to contribute. So just wanted to make that reference. And then I'll go through the agenda real quick, and then our hope is to do a quick poll with you all to understand who's with us before we get launched into the actual presentation. And the presentation tonight, again, is the first of a series of events to introduce the housing element, go through some frequently asked questions to make sure that you all have an opportunity to contribute and understand what the housing element is about, talk about the engagement to date and what's to come in the near future, and then some preliminary housing data that the LWC team has prepared and key planning considerations as we move forward through the process. We'll have an opportunity for a quick Q&A after that. Before we move into the core of this evening is the breakout sessions or small group discussions with you all. It's really important for us to hear from you tonight. That's the main reason we're here, to get your feedback. So again, we really appreciate you taking the time, and then we'll do a quick report out after that and then talk through next steps and kind of where we're headed from here. In terms of how this meeting will be facilitated, as you might have noticed, you are muted currently just to make sure that we don't have any accidental disruptions. But when we get to the small groups, we're going to facilitate that discussion through the hand raise feature. And depending on what version of Ring Central that you're using, that'll either be found at the participant window where you could use the raise hand feature there, or you might be able to get to it through your reactions button. And through the reactions button, if you don't have the raise hand, you could also just use the thumbs up or clap or any reaction, and we'll make sure that we unmute you. And then we can also take comments through chat. And you'll notice that the chat is actually available now. If you wanted to drop in any chat comments, you can as we move through the presentation. And we get to the Q&A, we're going to try to answer a few of those questions before we get to the small groups. But then we're also going to use that chat as another platform to take comments when we're in those small groups. So just wanted to make you all aware of that. So as I mentioned before we launch into the presentation here, and you'll see this pop up at every meeting, we'd like to take a quick live poll, really to understand who's with us here tonight. And to get a sense, most importantly, as we move through this process, who we haven't reached and be able to course correct as needed as we move through this series of events that we're going to have with you all to make sure that all perspectives that want to be part of this process are able to be. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually now go to a separate platform called Mentimeter. And what I'm going to ask you to do is access that. And you could simply pull up your mobile phone and go to this QR code, and that'll take you straight to the survey. And or you can go to a separate window and go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And then you're going to plug in this code, and this code will appear on the next screen as well. The code is 392505. And again, no worries if you don't get it right off the bat here, because what I'm going to do next, I'll give you all a second to try to log on if you can, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen and actually bring up that poll, which will have all the same information on it again. And we will go through that fun here together. So thanks for your patience. Let me go ahead and pull that up. And we will get launched right into the presentation. I'm going to share screen again here to make sure you all can see that. Okay, excellent. Looks like a bunch of you are already getting on. So again, you could either bring up your mobile phone directly to the screen and your camera will capture that QR code. And that'll take you directly to this poll. If not, you can go to menti.com in a separate window. And through that, if you type in the code 25392505, that will also take you to the poll. And if you don't have an opportunity to get to this now, no problem. It'll be available throughout the evening, so you can always come back to it if needed, and/or it'll also be available most likely after the meeting as well. So it looks like we have a bunch of folks that have been able to access it. So I'm going to go ahead and move the slide forward, and we'll jump right in. So the first question we typically like to ask is a very simple icebreaker, just to make sure that again test out the tool and make sure that you'll have access to it. So the first question I like to ask is, what do you love about Los Altos? And what you'll see here hopefully shortly is a bunch of answers pop up and a fun little word cloud that'll come together that will hopefully represent some of the perspectives here with us this evening. It looks like we have almost 48 or 49 folks from the community that have joined us here tonight, which is fantastic. So I'll wait here a second. As you can see, the words that show up largest on the screen are those that might have gotten a couple votes, or folks have mentioned more than once. It looks like weather, trees, people, location, all have gotten some diversity, downtown, walkability, schools, quiet. Excellent, excellent, really cool to see. So thank you all for taking the time to give us that input, and this will continue to evolve. And again, you can go back and forth through this poll at any time if you want to go back and check out what folks have said. It looks like you all are getting the hang of this quickly, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. So it looks like just a quick reference: trees, weather, people, diversity might have come up the most. So next, we're going to get into the demographics. And again, these are questions that we'll ask at every meeting, really to get a sense of who we're connecting with. And the first question is, where do you live? Either in Los Altos, outside of Los Altos, or other. And we'll see quickly here, it looks like, as we would have guessed, the vast majority of you live in Los Altos. So we'll go ahead to the next question. And next is, where do you work? Whether it's in Los Altos, in the county, outside the county, you may be retired, or you are looking for work or do not work. So just wanted to get a quick sense of that as well. And as you can see on the screen, as it tallies, looks like we have a fairly good variety of folks there. Excellent, thank you for that. Next is, which of the following reasons describes why you decided to attend this evening's workshop? And that could be you want to know more about the housing element, which we suspect you're concerned about housing, you want to support housing, and you could choose all that apply here. So whatever sounds good to you. And as you can see here, it looks like so far the majority is folks want to support more housing development in Los Altos. We're also getting some concern about housing development in Los Altos, and inevitably, obviously, most of you want to know more about the housing element. So great, thank you for that. I'm going to keep moving us forward here so we can get to the presentation as well. And then we just want to know if you've attended any events thus far. There have been some events out in the community, some pop-ups, and other opportunities to find out more about the housing element, which we'll talk about here shortly. So just curious who has an opportunity to contribute thus far. It looks like a majority of you, this may be your first event, which is totally great because you'll get a sense of everything that we've talked about to date as well. So thank you for that. And then a couple more questions about your current housing situation. If you own a home, rent a home, live with family or friends, do not currently have permanent housing, or any other. And here it looks like the vast majority of you own a home. All right, thank you for that. And next, what type of housing you live in, whether it's a home or a house, a duplex or condo, apartment, accessory dwelling unit, manufactured or mobile home. Okay, again, it looks like vast majority live in a house. Thank you for that. And then two more questions, we're almost there. So these are the typical demographic type questions that you might see in any census poll. Again, just trying to get a sense of who's joining us so that we can reach those in particular that we might not have a chance to reach here tonight. Excellent, thank you for that. And I promise the last question here before we launch into the presentation is, oh, two more questions, excuse me. One is race and ethnicity, and the next is going to be about household income. So again, we just want to get a sense of hopefully a diversity of perspectives that we'll be getting throughout the process. Okay, great. Thank you for answering that question. And then finally, as promised, is which bracket best describes your household income? And this will be the final question, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing screen, and then we'll launch right into the presentation. So thank you all for your patience and taking this poll with us. I hope you had a fun time doing it. And it's, again, this is really valuable information for us to have, one, to understand who's with us here tonight, and then also to really get a sense of who we're missing and who we need to continue to reach out to. So great. Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen here real quick and bring the presentation back up so that I could hand this over to Jen to get us started. So give me 1 second here while I bring the presentation back up. Alrighty. And I do see chat comments coming through. Thank you for that. And we'll definitely get to some of those comments as we get through the presentation and before we launch into the small group. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jen to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was great. Good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Jen Murillo with LWC. Next slide. And our presentation starts with some basics on housing elements. And if you happen to have watched or attended the December from Lisa Wise Consulting, that's LWC. Sorry, I'll turn off the chat here. Okay. So excuse me. So our presentation starts with some basics on housing elements. And for those of you who were at or watched the December City Council Planning Commission study session, some of this information will probably look familiar to you. Next slide, please. So what is a housing element? A housing element is a requirement of state law. State law prescribes what must be included in a housing element and when housing elements must be updated. Now, all the way back since 1969, the state has required that jurisdictions adequately plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in their community. And state law acknowledges that for the private market, for local developers to adequately address needs and demands of housing and in localities, the local government must work together with them, must provide opportunities for housing and not unduly constrain housing production. Now, housing elements are the key policy document to show and demonstrate that a city is planning for housing consistent with state law. And housing elements are required to be updated every 8 years. and they must be approved or certified by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. So this housing element that we're embarking on now is the housing element that will cover the 8-year period from 2023 to 2031. Next slide. So as a required section of the city's general plan, a housing element must assess the local housing needs and local housing conditions. It must look and address how the projected housing demand is accommodated within the city. And it also must include an action plan. And that plan sets forth goals, objectives, policies, and programs for the city to implement as their housing plan over the 8-year period. Next slide. So there are specific requirements that state law identifies. These are components you will see in the draft housing element. That includes a review of the existing housing element programs to assess what has been effective and should be continued or what could use some improvement. A housing needs assessment that will examine the demographic and housing trends, and it also looks at special needs populations. So looking at seniors, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, and others. We will also assess constraints to housing. So that includes constraints that are governmental, that could be zoning or permit and development review procedures. And it is non-governmental as well. So things like market conditions are also evaluated. A site's inventory is included, and that's a map along with a detailed list of all the parcels within the city that are available and can accommodate housing at specific income levels. And I'll talk about a few points about the site's inventory a little bit later on. An identification of resources, that can be things like programs and fundings that are available to support housing will be identified. And then lastly, that implementation plan. The plan for actions the city will take over the next 8 years to address housing. Next slide. The Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, is the number of units that each jurisdiction in the state must plan for in its housing element. So the state first determines the number of units that the region needs to plan for, and then these units were distributed among the Bay Area jurisdictions by the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG. And each jurisdiction must show how it can accommodate its RHNA for each affordability level. The total RHNA for Los Altos is 1,958 units. Of this, 843 are market rate units and 1,115 are below market rate units. Next slide. So the housing element identifies these local housing needs and the constraints to housing, and based on that analysis, develops programs to facilitate housing for those in need and to reduce barriers to housing production. So the housing element will also help by identifying the sites that can accommodate housing production, and that will help to identify and facilitate the supply of housing in Los Altos. Next slide. The housing element update process is about a year, is what we're targeting, with the completion at the end of this year, looking at adoption hearings in November and December. Throughout this process, there will be many public meetings and opportunities for input, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. But looking more towards the near term, we are planning on another community workshop in March, and then the release of the draft housing element for public review in April. Next slide. So we'll talk briefly about just some frequently asked questions. Next slide. And first, the project website, losaltoshousing.org, losaltoshousing.org contains many frequently asked questions. We have an FAQ section there. It includes questions related to RENA and community outreach. And we will be updating and expanding those FAQs throughout the process. So please, if you haven't already, take a look and let us know if you have any further questions so we can continue to improve and expand that resource. But just to touch on a couple, I mentioned RENA. That is the target number of units that must be planned for in the housing element. State law does not require the city to construct this housing, but rather ensure that the RENA is accommodated by the city's zoning, and construction is facilitated through city programs consistent with state law. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, can be projected over the housing element period and credited toward RENA too. And there continues to be a lot of new legislation passed that affects housing these days, and more to come. And in those cases, our housing element must be certified by the state. So we do rely on guidance from HCD to give us direction on how, if at all, we should or can be incorporating new bills into the housing element. Next slide. Public participation is a very significant component of the housing element. The state actually requires that a diligent effort to achieve participation from all economic segments of the community is done. And the city is working very hard to be proactive with outreach and adjusting to continue to enhance the efforts. So let's see, next slide, please. On the project website, again, losaltoshousing.org is where we have all the information about this project available. This does include the details of the engagement strategy, which the city has issued and approved. That's posted on the website under resources, but I'll go over some key parts of that here as well. So the website is really your primary resource for staying up to date, learning more, submitting comments and questions. You can sign up for email updates. So if you haven't already, get on the website and sign up for those emails. You can see upcoming events and view various resources that we'll be updating throughout the project. And it's also translatable. Next slide. So the engagement includes a range of activities to get participation. We have focus group meetings where we've talked to some developers and housing service providers, also offering small group meetings, which the city has held a number of already. The city is also doing pop-up events where staff is going out into the community at various locations to raise awareness and get input. And we are doing community workshops like this one tonight, where we'll have 2 more of these. And then there's also more formal study sessions and public hearings with Planning Commission and City Council. Next slide. So while we're still in the early stages of this project, we've received a fair amount of input so far. And this by no means reflect all comments received. This is just to get a sense of some of the things we are hearing. We've already had more comments since this presentation was put together. So we've heard things, a particular focus on the outreach component with a strong desire to ensure we have comprehensive engagement. That is our goal too. So we'll be, the city's working very hard to achieve that. We've heard concerns about high home prices, the need for starter homes, apartments, condos, ADUs. Also a focus on providing housing for key service providers in the community, police, firefighters, nurses, teachers, and the like. We've heard that preserving walkability with homes proximate to commercial is valued, and I think we saw some folks in the survey or poll we did say that as well. We've heard to retain the village atmosphere, but also be creative through this process. Many have identified that we should talk about potential housing sites or housing sites inventory early. And as such, we've scheduled a workshop in March, early March, where we are targeting the focus of that being the potential housing sites discussion. So we're looking forward to that in March. And then folks have mentioned that there are opportunities for housing in Los Altos, looking at areas like downtown and along commercial corridors. And then we've also heard about making sure we've got good outreach to seniors about available services too. Next slide. Again, that's just a handful of comments. All the comments that we receive, we're collecting, compiling. They will be integrated into the draft housing element. So please continue to provide comments and help us produce a really successful, strong housing element that reflects the city's and community's needs. Okay, so the housing element will include a very thorough analysis of data, needs, and conditions, but we wanted to provide some preliminary high-level data. These slides are posted on the project website. So if you go to this event, you can see these. I'm going to go over these fairly quickly. You can find more information there, and also a link to a data package with more data that will be forthcoming. Next slide. So in a quick comparison, looking at the city versus the county, Los Altos is an older community with slightly smaller household sizes than the county as a whole. There is a larger proportion of owner-occupied units. Comparatively, we saw that in the poll as well. Housing unit growth overall, or over the last decade, has been slower in Los Altos than the county. And in line with that, Los Altos has an older housing stock than countywide. While Los Altos and the county are becoming more diverse, Los Altos has a larger percentage of white population. And when we talk about these kind of high-level data points and characteristics, we think about them in relation to housing needs and needed services when we start to think about housing programs. Next slide. Affordability levels, when we talk about the housing element, are based on the county's area median income, or AMI, which is just over $151,000 for a four-person household. However, the median income in Los Altos is much higher than the county. But even so, 17% of households in Los Altos are considered low income. So 17% of households earning less than 80% of the area median income. Next slide. So these high incomes are also represented in high housing values in Los Altos. So last year, the typical home value was greater than $3.5 million. Teachers, firefighters, nurses' salaries, they aren't in line with these prices, and even much higher earning households can't afford housing in Los Altos. Next slide. So overpaying or being housing cost burdened is an issue for both homeowners and renters, with about 1 in 4 households in Los Altos paying more than 30% of their income on housing. So an issue for both owners and renters. Next slide. And then special needs housing groups are those more likely to face challenges with housing, and that includes seniors who are on fixed incomes and require higher levels of care. And almost 68% of lower income seniors are housing cost burden, paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. There are also 37 female-headed households with children that live below the federal poverty level in Los Altos. And additionally, approximately 6% of people have a disability that may require accessible housing. So providing housing that meets the needs of all in the community is part of the charge with the housing element. So we'll be looking at appropriate programs to help address special needs populations. Next slide. Okay, so lastly, there are a few key planning considerations to note kind of early on here, specific to the site's inventory, which we have a workshop scheduled for in March. Next slide. So due to the RENA and the existing conditions, built environment in Los Altos, we will have sites that aren't vacant or non-vacant properties included in the site's inventory. So these could be properties that have existing improvements, they have existing structures, existing uses, because there aren't enough vacant properties in the city to accommodate that almost 2,000 RENA number. So those non-vacant sites are expected to be identified based on underutilization, or having owner developer interest in building housing, and that they're buildable sites. They don't have access or other factors that would preclude housing. And then sites are considered, viable if they have leases that won't expire in the next 10 years or are well-performing, high demand uses that are not likely to convert to residential. So these are some things we're thinking about. HCD has also issued guidance for the site's inventory. This includes ensuring that the number of projected units for individual sites is realistic. It's based on development trends and site conditions and constraints. The state also requires that lower income sites be at least half an acre, unless there's a track record of producing lower income projects on smaller sites. Bottom line, our approach to the site's inventory is to be conservative and comply and adhere to the state's guidance. Next slide. So rezoning will be needed to accommodate the city's RENA. So of the almost 2,000 RENA units, we are preliminarily estimating that approximately 550 to 650 units would need to be accommodated through some level of rezoning. So this is only a third, meaning that a large portion of the RENA appears to be able to be accommodated through the city's existing zoning without change. So that's a good thing. We expect the rezonings to largely address the lower income units, and that approach being considerate of the city's existing neighborhoods and character. The city will also to a key consideration is that the city will also be required to maintain an adequate capacity on an ongoing basis for the RENA remaining through 2031. So for example, a site we identify, if it's developed with fewer units than we've projected, the city still has to make sure that there's available capacity for those units that weren't realized or built. So considering that, we're also being conservative, and we want to make sure we plan for having some capacity above the RENA in our site's inventory, so the city doesn't have to worry about potentially finding new sites after the housing element is adopted. So lastly, as I've stated before, community input is essential to this process. That's definitely true going along with the potential housing sites discussion, and we'll be talking about that in March. Just wanted to note some of these key planning considerations before we get into March. So with that, I thank you very much for your time. We really look forward to your questions and discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. We've seen a lot of great comments actually coming in through chat, most of which have been answered through chat. I just want to know one thing. There was a question about the polls and the results of the polls, and I just want to reiterate those are going to be as part of the meeting summary on the project website that Jen mentioned at losaltoshousing.org, and you'll see that come up a bunch, that website address. So please do go there as your main resource for all things housing update related. And there's a few other questions that we might not have responses to currently that we'll get to as part of the summary as well. So as part of the summary, we'll have all of these chat questions included and respond to those questions there as well. So team, I'm going to turn it back to you if there's anything else you'd like to mention before we move forward project team. I do see one hand raised. If you could please indulge us, we're gonna try to get to the small group exercise here shortly, and we can address any questions or comments there, just so we can make sure that we leave plenty of time for that. So if you have any other thoughts or comments, if you'd like to leave it through chat, please do so now. So I think we're gonna go ahead actually and move forward here. And this is great because I was a little bit nervous about how much time we had to actually spend with you on the small groups. That's gonna leave us plenty of time now to jump into that. But before we do, the next step here is we're gonna go back to the poll, and just to kind of prime us up for the discussion we're gonna have in the small groups, it's the same poll that you were just on, so you could bring it right back up. And if you didn't have a chance to contribute before, again, here's the QR code on the screen that you could bring up on your mobile phone, and or if you go to menti.com and put in this code that will be at the top of the next screen that I bring up. The code is 25392505. That would be a great help. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now and bring up that poll. So thank you for your patience. And then we'll get started there again. So, all right, it looks like some of you have already jumped in there, which is great. I'm going to bring it back up here.
Can we put the QR, somebody asked for the QR code back?
Yeah, the code is right here at the top of the screen. Yeah, so it'll be on the top of the screen on every slide. So just in case you weren't able to grab it, it's 25392505. If you wanted the QR code, I can bring that back up. I'll just have to bring the other slide back up here real quick. Hopefully this doesn't break the internet. Could you all see that okay? Did that come back up?
Yes.
So there's a QR code for those that might have missed it. But just as easy if you go to menti.com and plug in this code, both work concurrently. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the next slide here. So what we'd like to ask, and these are three main questions that we're going to ask again that will come up in the small groups. We wanted to poll the group as a whole before we transition to the small groups to get your sense. And the first question we have is, what do you think are the most critical housing issues in Los Altos? And for this question, it's all that applies, so you could mark them all or whatever you think are the most priorities. It's everything from the rate and number of new housing units getting built, protection for renters, concentration or segregation of certain groups, down payment assistance, financial assistance for repairs, fair housing issues, and access to quality housing, and the availability of housing for young families. So as you all could hopefully see along with me on this screen, it looks like the rate and number of new housing units getting built seems to be a critical housing issue. Fair housing issues, the availability of housing for young families is getting a lot of votes as well. So this is fantastic, really helpful. Again, this is just a primer to get the conversation started. When you get into the small groups, this is the first question that you're going to start with, and you'll see these results actually show up on the virtual whiteboard in your groups as you move into them as well to help spur the discussion. But great, really helpful to get a quick read of the group here. So the next question I'm going to ask is, what do you think are the housing types most needed in Los Altos? And that's everything, excuse me, for affordable housing, for low income households, or for middle income households, for sale condos or townhomes, rental housing, senior housing, housing with accessibility features for people with disabilities, or housing and or services for the unhoused. So again, you can mark all that apply here. And this question as well will be popping up in your small groups, but this gives you an initial opportunity to weigh in on this question. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And it looks like affordable housing for low income and middle income households seems to be getting the most votes so far, as you can see on the screen. We also see some votes for rental housing, for senior housing, for sale condos and townhomes. So everything is getting some input here. So this is great, appreciate it. And again, these results will then move along with you to the small group exercise. And lastly, before we get into those small groups, I want to ask one last question is, when assessing new housing that might be built in Los Altos in the next 8 to 10 years, what should be the city's most important consideration? And again, I asked if you want to maybe pick your top 3, you could choose all that apply here, but this would be really interesting to get your input on as well. Everything from energy efficiency and construction, new buildings designed to appear consistent with neighboring homes, protection of access to significant views, privacy, noise, and screening, historical buildings and landmarks, on-site amenities, walkability, maintaining high quality services and facilities, and traffic and parking. And you're seeing quickly here, tabulating walkability seems to be really important to you all, maintaining high quality services, traffic and parking, energy efficiency. Again, it looks like almost everything across the board is getting some input here, which is great to see. As you all are interested or understand the importance of all these issues. Excellent. Excellent, great to see. Walkability and maintaining quality still getting the highest votes. This is great. So these results as well are going to be available for you to spur your discussion as you move into the small group. So thank you again for taking the time to take that survey. I'm going to go ahead now while the results are still rolling in. This is great. Awesome. Awesome. So you'll have this as a basis to start from. So I'm going to stop sharing screen real quick here and bring the presentation back up so that I can walk you quickly through how we're going to set up the small groups. So let me go ahead and share screen again here. Thank you for your patience. Okay. So the breakout room discussion, again, as I mentioned before, we're going to use these 2 resources. One is going to be the hand raised. If you can please use the hand raise feature to let us know that you would like to contribute, and either that's the hand raise to your participant window, and or you could use a reactions, which if you don't have the hand raise option, you could pick any reaction you like, and that'll let us know that you want to speak, and or just raise your hand and we will see you on video hopefully, and then that'll give us a chance to unmute you so that we don't accidentally speak over each other, and or you could leave us your input through the chat, and you'll see we'll have a whiteboard up. There'll be a facilitator and a note taker for each group. The note takers will be taking down all the great input that you're giving us, and you'll be able to see that tabulate on the screen. And then we'll come back and do a short report out after about half an hour or so of discussion, and then let you know kind of what was discussed in each one of the rooms, and then talk about next steps, and then we'll send you on your way. So with that, I'm going to make a quick minor adjustment here. Looks like we had a few new folks that joined us here since we got started, which is great. I'm going to make sure we kind of even out the rooms. Okay, I think we are ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and open up all the rooms here. And as I do, if you haven't experienced this before, it's going to move you automatically into the rooms. And then while you're in there, your facilitators are going to mute all mics again so you don't accidentally speak over each other. I'll be sending out reminders, and then we'll all come back together here in about a half an hour. Some of you are actually going to stay right here in the main room. This will be room 1, and there'll be 2 other rooms that will also be available. And then once we close the rooms, you'll see a 60-second timer pop up, and then that will be your warning that we're moving back to this main room together. So unless there's any other updates from the team, I'm going to go ahead and open all the rooms. Have a great time. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Hi all, for those that are joining back the main room, welcome back. We're just going to wait a couple seconds here to make sure everyone has a chance to rejoin us. And then as promised, we're going to do a short report out just to hear the great discussion that was being had in each one of the rooms. And it sounds like it was really great, robust discussion. We'd love to hear a little bit about what each group talked about. And then we'll go through a quick round of next steps to let you know what's to come, and then send you on your way, hopefully right around 8 o'clock as promised. So it looks like everyone is back here with us now. So I'm just going to go right down the list. Jen, if you are ready, I'm going to hand it over to you to do a very quick report out of key themes that your group talked about, and then we'll go to the other two groups. So Jen, you're up.
Sure. We talked about a lot, but a few key points I wanted to note from our group one, is we did talk about ADUs as an important type for providing housing, with some of the folks in the group having firsthand experience of getting ADUs permitted through the city, and the desire to help facilitate or streamline that process, as it does appear to be quite cumbersome and lengthy in the city. And also for the fact that the city has a lot of single family properties and large lot properties that could accommodate ADUs. To be able to facilitate that would be a good opportunity for housing and rental housing. We had some concerns about focusing on development being compatible with neighborhoods and adjacent properties, with concern about protecting the R1 zone. We did have interest in multiple housing types in addition to ADUs, looking at small scale housing types that could be duplexes, 3 units on a lot that are compatible with adjacent properties, but also looking at higher density townhomes, multifamily developments too, being considerate in terms of providing sufficient open space and play areas for children, families. We did also hear that there are quite a few vacant single family homes in neighborhoods, and that there may be an opportunity to see if the city can take advantage and encourage those homes to be occupied, to be rented, versus being kind of overseas investments and vacant a lot of the time.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Jen. Dave, you're up next.
Yes, so my group had a lot of support for the production of more housing in Los Altos, and particularly below market rate housing. A lot of concern for segments of the society that have not been able to access housing in Los Altos, in particular young adults who may have grown up in the community and aren't able to return to Los Altos, as well as a concern for people who work in providing services, education, et cetera, within Los Altos, who don't have access to housing in the community. So there was a real concern that the city target those segments of society and consider them as key stakeholders and key benefit, a key need that should be addressed in the housing element. One other element that came up in our conversation very strongly was concern about the city's constraints to housing development, that the development code has in the past been an impediment for the production of housing, that development standards are such that it makes it very difficult even for market rate housing to be produced. And ADUs, we had reporting experience that it's very difficult to get ADUs entitled, permitted, and developed in Los Altos. So looking at and addressing those very real constraints is important. There's concern that the rate of housing production that occurred during the 5th cycle was insufficient, and that the city needs to take a look at what it can be doing more proactively to encourage investment on identified sites in the 6th cycle. There were a number of questions in the chat about SB 9, and I would recommend a separate effort from the city maybe to address those. We didn't really discuss them in our group, but there were lots of questions and concerns in the chat that focused on SB 9.
Great, thank you for that, David. And last but not least, we'll go to Laura to do a quick report out of your group.
Yes, we had similar themes. We had a lot of support for housing needs for lower income people who work in the city, the workforce, and also young people who were born or grew up here and would like to stay in the community. So the needs for future generations were important. Um, Also, a key issue that came up was good urban planning, making sure that the infrastructure, had the capacity to handle the new developments, and that it was appropriately placed where there were near amenities like transit or walkability. So that was a key issue. But it was also brought up that the length of time that it takes to get developments through development process is costly and can be too long. And so looking at ways to reduce the time it takes to get through development processes and to really increase the supply. So there was support for, increasing the supply of housing and to reduce the barriers that might be there in terms of adding time and cost. But we had a lot of great comments. I can't even cover them all. So it was great.
Yeah, excellent. I was bopping back and forth between the rooms, and it sounded like there was some fantastic discussion and a lot of great notes for us to sift through and put together a summary. So thank you all again for your time this evening. That was really great to hear your input and to give you a quick overview of the housing element update process. I'm going to hand it back over to Jen now to talk us quickly through next steps before we wrap up.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. So again, thank you so much for all your time tonight. We are going to issue a summary report from this meeting. So these report outs are brief. We know there were a lot of comments we didn't mention. We'll document those in a summary report. And then again, those will all be integrated into the draft housing element. So looking forward, we are continuing with outreach, education, and the technical analyses that supports the housing element behind the scenes. Upcoming meetings, if you want to save a couple dates, we do have a February 3rd Planning Commission slated to talk about housing constraints. That was definitely a theme across all the breakout rooms tonight, so that will be a good discussion with the Planning Commission that has specific insight into the details of zoning and permit procedures. Then again, that March 1st date is the second community workshop to talk about housing sites. So save the date for that as well. That will be in the evening. And then looking forward to April, doing a lot of work over the next few months with a draft housing element being released in April for your review. Next slide. So we've plugged the website a bunch tonight. Please go to losaltoshousing.org, sign up for project emails, find out more information, and please let us know what we can do to answer your questions and provide more information to help to have a successful dialogue as we move forward on this project. So thank you again so much. We really, and also feel free to email directly to housingaltosca.gov. This presentation is on the website, so if you have any questions or want to look back at anything, you can go to the events and find it. Thank you very much for your time. We look forward to working with you for this project.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a fantastic evening. Thank you again for your time. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.